Hi guys, welcome to our daily encounter. As we get to 1 Kings chapter 19, we find a prophet who is physically, spiritually, and mentally exhausted. He was physically exhausted because he had been enduring a famine just like the rest of Samaria. But then when the rain came, he ran a good 18 miles ahead of Ahab to Jezreel. So we can imagine perhaps how physically demanding that would have been. But he was also spiritually exhausted because he had stood up for the Lord. He had stood up against the prophets of Baal. He had stood for the Lord. He had done everything in being faithful to God, in proving that those prophets were wrong and having those prophets put to death. He had been very faithful to the Lord in speaking to Ahab, only to find that Jezebel wanted to kill him. She had put out a word that she was going to have him killed about that same time the next day. And he goes running for his life. And so spiritually, perhaps he's exhausted. He feels like he's the only prophet. He's the only one left really being faithful to the Lord. And yet this hardship had come upon him. So he's spiritually exhausted, but he's also mentally exhausted because he's running for his life. It says that he was afraid in verse 3, and he was afraid and arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. So he's mentally exhausted because he's fearful of what Jezebel's going to do. And so this is a man who's exhausted through and through, and he's just ready to die. He just wants the Lord to let him die. Let him lie and let him die. However, an angel comes and provides him with bread and water, a jar of water to drink. And this revives him a bit. And then he goes back to sleep again. And then the angel touches him again and said, "Arise, eat, because the journey is too great for you." And he arose and ate and drank again. And it says that from that point on, he went for a good 40 days and nights without food or water, or he went in the strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God, which was a good 200 miles away. So here we see an exhausted prophet, but also one who was touched by an angel and who was strengthened by God. And he was strengthened in two ways. He was strengthened the first time to recover the exhaustion that he had felt before, to allow him to be revived, to recuperate, to be restored once again. And then the second time he was fed to meet the journey that laid ahead as he made his way to Mount Horeb, that long journey that he had before him. And as we think about this, we could see that, this shows the grace of God in basically two ways. It shows that God has the grace to restore us when we're mentally, physically, spiritually exhausted because of past journeys that we've had. When we look to the past and we think about the hardships, the trials that we've had, maybe they've been physically demanding, like Elijah. Maybe they've been spiritually demanding as we feel as though we've been faithful and yet we've only encountered difficulty and hardship. Maybe it's emotionally exhausting because of various reasons. But we look in the past and we just feel exhausted. We feel exhausted in serving the Lord, trying to be faithful to the Lord, and yet still meeting hardships and trials. And so what we find in that particular case is that we have bread and we have water to drink of and to eat of in those when we think about the past. Because Christ is our living bread and he's also the living water. And when we become exhausted spiritually and emotionally and physically, we can come to the Lord and say, "Lord, I need to be restored again. I need Christ to come into my heart, into my very being, and restore me once again, to refresh me again." And when we do that, we're going to find the sweet slumber of rest that comes in resting and abiding in Christ. And he's going to restore us and he can uplift us and renew us once again. But then also as we look to the future and we see the long journey that perhaps lies ahead, maybe we see the dangers, the hardships that lie before us in the next week or the next month or maybe the upcoming years, and we see that journey ahead of us, that too can cause us perhaps to feel perplexed, fearful, and become exhausted just even thinking about it. But yet still we have a second grace, we could say, in the Lord who will strengthen us for the journey that lays ahead as well. That he will not just restore us from the exhaustion of the past, but also strengthen us for the journey that lays ahead. And it's that same bread and living water that will supply us and help us and strengthen us for the long journey ahead. And so we find that Christ is our all in all. He is the grace both to restore, but also the grace to strengthen. And he will help us to encounter, to endure the hardships and the trials of this life. So if we find ourselves exhausted in any of these ways that are similar to Elijah, we can look unto the Lord, look to Christ, set our eyes on Christ, fix our eyes on Christ, abide in Christ by being in communion with him, in prayer with him, by reading of the words of Christ and drawing close to him. And he will help us to be restored, but then continuing on, he'll give us the strength to endure tomorrow's challenges and help us make it all the way through to the end. So these are some things we can reflect on and think about as we do our reading today. With that, guys, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.